So yeah, I guess and thanks for having me here, Karen, and thanks everybody for coming. Not that you all had much of a choice. So I'm gonna. I think what I'm gonna do is talk a little bit about. I'm gonna run through the reporting process of the story that Karen had me come here for this, which is about. This was a story about pretrial detention in Chicago. So basically, it's about the Chicago jail, where people who are charged with crimes but not yet convicted, people who are legally innocent in the eyes of the law, spend weeks, months, sometimes years awaiting trial, awaiting to see whether a jury, and in some cases judges, think that they're actually guilty or innocent. In a lot of cases, these are people who cannot afford to pay their bail, so they are incarcerated under very punishing conditions in the Cook County Jail, which is Cook County, Chicago, quite literally because they can't pay to get out. So I'm going to go through just kind of step by step the reporting process there, and I'm probably going to explain some things to you all that you already know pretty well, so my apologies for that. I'll probably go into a bit too much detail on other things, but hopefully it'll kind of, if anything, it'll give you guys, I mean, is there anybody here who is actually interested in potentially pursuing a career in journalism? Okay, a few, great. So yeah, I mean, I feel like when I was in college, my kind of idea of what being a reporter was like versus what it's actually like is a lot different. And I can talk about that a little bit more after I'm done going through this, but I feel like there is, yeah, I mean, this might help you guys get just a little bit more of a sense of kind of what reporters are actually doing when they're doing investigative work. So basically, I think the first, and if you're interested in a career in PR or something like that, and communications, anything that might be related to journalism, maybe you'll pick up some tips here too. So to start out with, there is the first thing is finding the story, and I think especially in investigative reporting, actually finding a frickin' story that's good and hasn't been reported already to death is one of the most important tools and one of the most important skills that you can have, and there's no one way to go about that. In this case, I came to this story of pretrial detention and the excesses and abuses in the system in Chicago by reading a different story. And I think you all may have received a forwarded email from me with a couple of story links that if you had time, maybe you glanced at. But so the original inspiration for me to even look at Chicago was from this New Yorker article by a really fantastic reporter named Jennifer Garnerman, who wrote the story of a 16-year-old boy named Khalif Browder, who was wrongfully arrested in the Bronx for allegedly robbing a guy on the street, and ended up going to Rikers Island, which is New York's infamous jail, and spending 3 years there under just incredibly traumatic circumstances. I mean, he was in solitary confinement for, I think, 17 to 20 months of those 3 years. And his charges were bogus, and he never got his day in court, and eventually the DA just threw out his case. He returned home a completely changed person, and I think roughly a year after this really tremendous piece, and if you guys didn't have a chance to read it, don't worry about reading the articles by me that I sent you. Please read this story, because it is one of the best pieces of journalism I've probably ever read. It's just incredible. And so about a year after this came out, Khalif Browder was home from jail, struggling with a lot of post-traumatic stress from his 3 years in Rikers, and committed suicide tragically. And it is, in addition to being a very good piece of journalism, it was one that had a lot of impact, this New Yorker story. It really kind of launched the entire subject of pretrial detention and the injustices in pretrial into the national conversation in a very real way. So basically, I was affected by the story, and I, through a few conversations with my editor, where I previously did a good deal of work, which is the Investigative Fund, which is a kind of a nonprofit in New York that funds individual stories and then places them in publications where they're appropriate. The Investigative Fund allows reporters to focus on, to kind of do deep dives, do close examinations, spend a lot of time on individual stories. So, through a few conversations with editors there, kind of said, like, in the wake of the Kalief Browder story, there's been a ton of focus on pretrial detention in New York City and Rikers Island, and for some reason the focus keeps doubling down on Rikers Island. Let's see what's going on in the rest of the country. Because the story for some reason hadn't quite broken out, and I don't think my story helped that much, but so in terms of finding the story, we decided that the way to do this was to utilize something that you guys may have heard of before called public records request. Often it's known of as a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request. And what these are, over the past century, the federal government and every state government around the country have basically enacted legislation with the idea that taxpayers are the various municipal, state, and federal government agencies around the country work for taxpayers, so we get to see inside their data. We get to these are laws that grant both journalists and students and any person in the United States access to government data if you basically use the right language in asking. You have to cite the statute. I mean, it's funny because these are things that are kind of these are coveted by reporters. I mean, this is a really powerful tool in reporting, and a lot of kind of seasoned reporters that I've worked with are not even that familiar with how to do it. In some cases, people who I look up to have never filed a FOIA request and are a little bit intimidated by the process. And the fact is that it's an incredibly easy thing to do. And if any of you are interested in journalism or are currently writing for a student newspaper or freelancing for any kind of publication, I would encourage you to just go for some FOIA requests. So basically, what the FOIA request is you write to a government agency and ask for records, and all you have to do is cite the relevant statute. So in Pennsylvania, I think it's called the Right to Know Act here. If you're filing with a federal agency, you file it under the Freedom of Information Act request. And it's just the easiest thing to do. People are for some reason scared of it because it seems a little bit legalistic or something, but I mean, there's just no downside to filing a FOIA request. You're never going to get in trouble. So I think if you're interested in maybe trying to impress somebody at a publication that you might be applying to theoretically in the future, just maybe go for filing some FOIA requests. So what we did here, and represent yourself honestly, and common with just the modicum of common sense, nothing can go wrong, I don't think. So basically the idea here was that jails around the country keep data on their inmate populations. Every jail keeps and collates lots of data on their inmate populations. So there's jails sitting on loads and loads of data, and nobody was looking at it. So we decided at the Nation Institute to file dozens of FOIA requests all around the country to take a look at, to peek inside the data that's kept by all these jails. And specifically, we filed requests asking for the portion of pretrial detainees, people awaiting trial and have not been convicted and are still legally innocent or still incarcerated, who have been detained pretrial for more than 2 years. That was a standard in New York that, it's a kind of a random benchmark, but it's kind of the multiple year standard was something we were interested in, as just kind of saying hey,
2 years seems like a really long time. Let's see who your inmates are, who pretrial detainees are, who have been awaiting trial for more than 2 years, and see what's going on. So this is the Foia request. This is the state version. I mean, so state records laws also pertain to local agencies. So this is the Foia request that I filed, the public records request I filed with the Cook County Sheriff's Department, which runs the Cook County Jail. And this was the request that started this entire story, and it was one of a lot of requests. It's actually kind of a crappy request, and this is like, another thing about FOIA requests is like they don't have to be perfect, and people like wring their hands over these requests and making them perfect, but actually like, unless there's like a record you know is there and you need to get, I think like just, I ended up refining this request a lot as the project moved forward, and we did subsequent passes at the records that these agencies had. So if you're interested and want a better version of this request, I can like send it over email or something. I'd be happy to do that. But if you guys want to just pass this around and take a look, I only made a dozen copies for some reason. So yeah, and
So you sort of
yes, sorry. So we filed requests that looked basically identical to these at different, a few dozen jails across the country, and got back some pretty, pretty striking data sets, some pretty interesting stuff. And then, I was at my desk one day, and the Sheriff's Department in Chicago called me, and they were like, so we're processing your request, and we have more than 1,000 detainees who are pre-trial and are responsive to your request, so it's going to take us a little while. And I was like, what? Wait. So in New York City, there was this entire U.S. Attorney's investigation into Rikers Island. There was the Cleve Browder story, generated obviously a lot of public interest in New York City and pretrial detention. And the numbers there, so Rikers Island, which is a larger jail than Chicago's Cook County Jail, had 400 people who had been awaiting trial for more than 2 years. And that was a big deal and a big problem. And Chicago's jail is actually a little bit smaller. Rikers had around 11,000 inmates, most of them pre-trial. Cook County Jail had, I believe, 8,000 pre-trial detainees. So they called me and said, yeah, we're processing a request. We actually have 1,000 people who are responsive to this request. So it's pre-trial detainees who are legally innocent, awaiting their day in court. And so this was twice the number that had been reported in New York City for Rikers Island. So the Chicago story was an obvious place to start. And this was actually we originally kind of envisioned this as a national story where we get data nationally and kind of write some kind of story that compared jurisdictions and things like that. That actually never panned out, partially because I spent so much time in the Chicago story, partially because I got a different job after the Chicago story came out. So eventually the Cook County Sheriff's Department sent us this enormous data set on, their 1,050 or something people who have been awaiting trial in jail for more than 2 years. And there were most of these detainees were facing charges for violent crime, a lot of murder, a lot of rape, a lot of assault. Then there were a lot of people who were there for a lot less serious things, including larceny, including petty larceny, and there were a ton of people who had just been caught with guns. I mean, obviously guns are bad, but the people who had gun raps, I mean, so over the years, the legislature in Illinois has create a lot of kind of sentencing enhancers for gun charges, which really kind of I mean, it's getting into a bit of a kind of tough place because Chicago is having so much gun violence. It's like right now it's kind of gun violence capital of the country. But the kind of sentences you're seeing for people getting caught with guns is just unbelievable. Like you're talking like if they have a prior felony rather than be kind, and you get caught with a gun in Chicago, you're facing decades. And so there were nonviolent crimes that people who had not yet been convicted or taken any kind of guilty plea or awaiting trial for a long time. And all those people were only in jail because they couldn't afford to get out. So more than half of the people awaiting trial for more than 2 years were there in Chicago. So around 500 people were there because they couldn't afford their bail. And we could see that in the statistics in the data set, this big Excel file that Cook County sent us. So this is kind of getting into a big, issue with document journalism, which is kind of something I'm doing a lot right now at where I work, ICIJ, which just did Paradise Papers. So this is something I've been struggling with, basically, for a couple of years now since this project, and my latest one, is you get a document, it has striking statistics in it that should be reported out, but it doesn't tell you the story behind those statistics. It doesn't tell you what's going on, why they're there, who's being affected, how. So you have this problem of getting the story and figuring out what the heck is going on. The first place that any reporter would call in this situation is defense attorneys. Defense attorneys are generally fantastic sources who are just sitting on tons of stories that for some reason they never give a reporter until you call them and start chatting. They're the people who see the underbelly of your criminal justice system. And the defense attorneys who I called in Chicago initially didn't want to talk to me because they felt in some way implicated by the statistics and what I was asking about specific cases. Defense attorneys feel like they're a bit on the hook for their clients being held in jail for months and months and years in some cases. In the Khalif Browder story in the New Yorker, the defense attorney comes off not so good. This guy in the Browder case, his defense attorney never visited him once, 3 years in jail. Never sat down and talked to him. So that was actually a dead end, which was disappointing. And without, we needed story, we wanted to hear what was going on with these cases. So if the defense attorneys won't talk, who's going to? So without any real other ideas, I just started writing letters to random people who we had in the data, we had the name of the actual name and inmate number of every pretrial detainee who was incarcerated in Cook County. So pretty much at random, I wrote a few dozen people, I think just over 2 dozen people, saying, hey, I'm a reporter with the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute. This is what I'm doing. I just kind of laid out the story pretty straightforwardly and said, write back, call me, get a relative to get in touch if you want to talk. Obviously, anything you tell me can be used by the prosecution against you, especially if you call me or write. They can't. Inmates have very little ability to communicate without being recorded. Their letters can be read. Their outgoing or incoming letters can be read by the prosecution. That might be a little bit far-fetched in Cook County because everybody's stretched really thin, but still, it's a risk. Whenever they're talking to a reporter, it's a risk. So it's slightly dicey talking to pretrial detainees who there is a lot on the line. It's not certain by any means that talking to me will help them get less jail time, get less prison time, get them stronger. So I sent these letters and said, whatever, we'll see how it works. And a few weeks later, I started getting letters back from the people that I wrote to, and I started getting letters from people I didn't write to, because the people in jail, the Cook County Jail, had circulated my contact information, and okay, this guy is writing about this, and which is, another thing about, journalism. When you reach out to people, usually they'll talk to other people, and sometimes you'll get lots more sources that are incredibly useful that you thought you would set out. So, and the letters that I got were just kind of, in a lot of cases, they're pretty heartbreaking. In a lot of cases, I think Americans, including myself, have a lot of kind of preconceived notions about people who might be in jail awaiting trial for violent crimes, and these letters I got were just kind of in some cases they were illegible, but in some cases they were completely impeccable grammar, composition, and from here's the eyes of any high school or college writing teacher. These were seriously well educated people who were in some cases high school and college age, and could really write. So obviously, maybe that shouldn't have been surprising to me, but it was. These were impressive letters. One of these letters was from a guy named Jermaine Robinson, who wrote just a great letter, and he became the subject of my story. He actually awaited trial for a gun possession charge that turned out to be bogus for 4.5 years. And I think he went in to the Cook County Jail when he was 20, if I remember correctly, and wrote me the letter when he was 24, I think, and said like, hey, I've got a story for you, and I can't remember how much he gave me in the letter about a specific story, but he said contact family, gave me numbers. So I called his mom, and she was like, this is travesty. My son has been held unexposed charges, they won't let him go, and they also won't let him go to trial. Her theory was that the prosecution, is also a theory in Blake Browder's story, basically the criminal justice system in the United States works on, it's based on the guilty. 95% of criminal charges, criminal convictions are gotten through a guilty plea. Very few people statistically go to trial. And in some cases, the system is stacked up so much against you, you'll plead guilty to a crime, even if you didn't do it, especially if you're incarcerated and trying to get out of jail. So people had given, in Khalif Browder's case, the prosecution offered him lowered his charges from a felony, I believe felony larceny and assault charge, to little misdemeanors, and said, we'll just bring you today if you plead guilty, so we can so the prosecution can look good, they got their guilty plea. And he said no. Waited in jail for another few months, and then the prosecution couldn't, they had no witnesses, they had no case, they had to dismiss the case, and luckily it was dismissed, it looks like, because it went to a good judge, got transferred to a judge who was kind of doing her job. And I was lucky for him. So in Jermaine Robinson's case, he was still fighting his case. His mom believed that the Cook County criminal justice system was keeping him in jail in hopes to extract a guilty plea. And more specifically, she thought that it was the Chicago Police Department that was actually effectuating this by simply not showing up, by having his arresting officers not show up to court for his pretrial hearings. You can't get to trial until you go through all these pretrial hearings. It's just a nightmare, right? So over and over again, he would show up to court, and his arresting officer wouldn't be there, so the judge would say, go back to jail, we'll schedule this for the next available slot that I have. I have to try again. Often the next available court hearing would be, it wasn't like a week later. It was often 2 weeks later, sometimes 6 weeks, sometimes 2 months. You'd have to wait for the court to try again to get the cop to come in to arrest him. And that's where his case was when they called me, when I called his mom in February of 2016. I got in touch with a few other people. People kept kind of, there was another character in my story named Ernest Leaks, who had another gun charge, and he had been awaiting trial for also for 4 years. He had been arrested right around the same time as Jermaine Robinson, and he also said the cops wouldn't show up. They want to get a guilty plea. They don't want to face the judge. So it's kind of like, this seems like such a random. These must be one-off cases. This can't be kind of a systemic thing. Cops not showing up to court. That's like ridiculous. And the more people I talk to, the more that this issue of police truancy seemed to be pretty widespread within the system and creating a lot of unnecessary trial delays for people who are incarcerated. It was one of a lot of things that were causing delays. Partially, it was it's very familiar in New York City, which is a super backlogged court system. There's also a DNA lab that took forever to turn around results for people. So that you can't go to, your defense attorney doesn't want you to go to trial if you don't know what the prosecution has. And if the prosecution is waiting a year to get test results back, then you've got no choice but to wait. But this police thing seemed like a big cause of pretrial delay for these people who, and it seemed like one that was avoidable, very avoidable. So the story ended up focusing on that as well. It put a special focus on that because it seems like such a not an intractable problem, and tried to kind of get at the other sources also. So that Ernest Leaks, for instance, literally, I mean, this actually happened. He awaited trial for 4 years, and 2 of those 4 years he was waiting for his cops to show up, which is unbelievable. And so both he and Jermaine Robinson, I mean, they had weirdly kind of, their cases had nothing to do with each other, but they had weirdly overlapping kind of time frames. They both beat their cases. I mean, the state dropped the charges against Jermaine Robinson and gave Ernest Leaks a kind of a bogus misdemeanor plea. They reduced it to, like, go ahead, plead guilty. And so I actually got to speak with both of them, and that kind of, and they, in kind of in the meantime, I couldn't talk to them when they were incarcerated, so it was lucky for them and lucky for the story that they were able to get out while I was still writing. Ernest Leaks died a few days after he got out. He overdosed on heroin. But I luckily got to speak with him briefly, and he sent me a few letters, and I was in touch with his family. And it was a fentanyl overdose, and I mean, it's he's somebody who had his fair share of drugs in his life, and his friends I was in touch with speculated that he probably his 4 years in jail that drove him to. He was also struggling. He was also had mostly untreated leukemia in jail, and when he got out, he had a lapse in his pain medication. There was some kind of problem with the jail transferring the prescription, or just like kind of horrible stuff, and then his friend believed that he basically was pushed by the pain, the physical pain of the lapse in his leukemia medication to the fentanyl. So he died very, very quickly after within a week after And so yeah, I mean that's and the people I spoke with, both the detainees themselves, the families, and I eventually did get in touch with some advocates in Chicago who had been very involved in pretrial detention and abuses in the system, as well as defense attorneys. I mean, I did a few months of reporting on this, so I eventually did find some defense attorneys who were willing to talk, and they kind of inevitably led me both to the police department, state crime lab, and other sources of pretrial delay that then caused me to do further kind of public records requests, one of which led to us getting some data from the police department about their rate of how many cops have, missed court in recent years, and their, I mean, I'm suspicious, I'm not positive their record keeping is totally on point. Who knows? Maybe it is. But by their own count, they say in the past several years they've reported 11,000 court absences. So it's kind of like this cycle where you can file you file a records request, you get a document, all of a sudden you have a story, you reach out to people, you get quote human sources, and then that leads you to more documents, and then those lead you to more human sources. So that's kind of like one way that I view this, and that's kind of that story. And there's not much else, it's kind of, it's like it came out. I worked on and off on this story for about a year, and it came out a week after Trump was elected, and the news cycle was just such a nightmare in terms of election coverage, because everybody was kind of so surprised by him winning, that the story didn't get very much attention. But yeah, I mean, we weren't expecting it to get that much attention, because these kind of long, plotting criminal justice investigations usually don't really make the front page or anything. But it really flopped. Like nobody was sharing it online or anything. And I think it didn't really make any impact, but hopefully people who are studying this in Cook County read it. I know they did read it, and maybe it'll kind of help advance things a little bit. I mean, I think Philadelphia is actually on the better end of the spectrum in terms of pretrial justice, I think. This is kind of just a notion I have, so I actually don't know this, but certain court systems have units in them that kind of police judges, and one of the problems in Cook County that was a really big deal is that judges wouldn't. If you're a witness in a criminal case, you have to show up. You don't just get to not show up. And if you don't show up, a lot of the times if you don't show up once, the judge will issue a warrant for your arrest. And they do that. Judges do that a lot. But in Chicago, they would not ever do it for a police officer. And that kind of, a lot of judges all over the country, and definitely in Cook County, are former prosecutors who are very kind of pro-law enforcement. And this is just kind of one manifestation of what happens when you have an incredibly pro-law enforcement bench. There's a slant. And I think that would be obvious, and it results in Cook County, no one I spoke with ever having heard of a judge issuing a bench warrant for these at least 11,000 police witness absences. So, and let's see. I mean, this, I think this jail data is really interesting and rich stuff, and I wish I kind of could have kept doing this story. And there's some of the, we definitely saw some interesting stuff in a lot of jurisdictions. I just saw a story, and I think the Miami Herald, where they took a look at some jail data and saw that the Miami-Dade jail, or whatever jail is in Miami, had been holding people for misdemeanors who had $25 bonds. All they had to pay was $25, but they didn't have it. So they were literally holding people on misdemeanor charges in jail for months, which is just like, I mean, you know, I don't think there are really two sides to that story. That's just egregious, and it's also a big cost to taxpayers. So if anybody in here is interested in filing Foia requests, I think of, you know, the local jail, and what county are we in here? Yeah, like why not? Let's see what's there. And yeah, I mean, yeah, so that's that. And if you guys have any questions, you know, I'm happy to answer questions about this story. And I'm also, the more recent thing I did was the Paradise Papers, which was my organization, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, obtained a cache of 13 million leaked documents, mostly from an offshore services provider, which is a law firm based in Bermuda called Appleby, which helps the kind of richest people and most powerful corporations move their assets offshore to tax havens like the Cayman Islands, Virgin Islands, Bermuda, that obviously let them avoid taxes and provide them a really deep degree of financial secrecy. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions about that too. If anybody happens to have anything, if people don't have questions, I can just keep talking about something random.
Might be some questions.
Miles actually a co-county from the judge.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I was wondering, did you reach out to any judges if you ever done
Yeah. We reached out to a few individual judges. We reached a couple individual judges involved with Jermaine Robinson's case and Ernest Leak's case. And the judge in Ernest Leak's case had allowed the arresting police officers to miss 2 years of court dates without ever issuing a warrant. So we asked both him directly and his boss, the Cook County chief judge, what's going on with that? Why did you do that? And they didn't respond. The chief judge's office, I was rereading this report, and I actually didn't get this kind of horribly long story, and I didn't get to the bottom of it, the bottom of the piece. And they actually, the chief judge's office did respond to something really kind of fairly boilerplate, standard, like it wasn't anything very informative or interesting. But I think one thing that they said was that they're working with the police department to improve, what did they say, like show-up rates or appearance rates. But we didn't get much from the judges, yeah. But I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was interesting to at least hear that they've acknowledged that was an issue. Judges generally don't like to talk much though, so that was no surprise, yeah.
Could you let the students know what your path was from the time you first got interested in journalism to becoming an investigative journalist?
I graduated college in 2010, and I got I guess my first kind of gig was an internship at Harper's Magazine, and then I kind of wandered through the wilderness of a lot of freelance fact-checking and trying to figure out reporting for, I've made my living for most of my 20s, supporting myself mainly on fact-checking, which is that is a profession. Like, work for magazines and newspapers, get reporters to hand over all their sourcing to you and tear apart their stories and make sure there's nothing wrong. There's always lots of stuff wrong, but they know it's going to fact check. And that kind of allowed me, I mean, the fact checking as experience, I think, is really fantastic if you're going into, if you want to go into report or investigative reporting. Freelancing it's rough. And as a fact checker, kind of, you're at the bottom of the totem pole. So people in a lot of cases don't treat you great, but it was a good experience. So I worked at a business magazine called Inc. Magazine for 2 years, my mid-20s. And then I worked as a contract fact checker for a while at the Intercept when they were first starting out. And probably about 3 years ago, I was kind of at the point where I was mostly writing and still fact checking. The kind of, I slowly weaned my way on fact checking and had kind of figured out by that time, and this took a long time to figure out, like, what is this story? What's a story that people are going to want? How do you pitch it? And how do you write it? And yeah, the fact checking helped enormously with that. But I would, for anybody interested in a career in journalism, I would really not recommend going the freelance route. It's like the pay is pretty bad, and you're kind of generally people's like last priorities. Like editors will ignore you. You'll get stories. I mean, your payment is contingent on stories getting published in a lot of cases, which is like terrible. Because if your story gets killed, then not only has this thing that you put a lot of work and put your heart and soul into, not only is that gone, but you're also not going to be paid. So yeah, I mean, the freelance life is pretty hard, and I would really recommend anybody going to journalism to get a job doing, just try to get hired doing even. I mean, I think the best path, like the path that so many Austin reporters take, is they get a job. Their first job is at like the most like a small town newspaper, and then they'll go to a slightly bigger newspaper, and then they'll end up at a national paper. And that, I think, is if you're okay with not being in a major city for a little while, and you're like really in the mid-20s or whatever, that's like awesome. Unfortunately, that part of the industry is also dying, so it's like harder to do that. But you know, I'm from a small town in North Carolina called Hillsborough, and it's like, you know, 4,000 or 5,000 people. They have this little newspaper that has 2 reporters, and I've heard of some people getting their starts there. This guy, this New York Times reporter, who's just a fantastic reporter, who I co-wrote a story with earlier this month with Paradise Paper, Scott Shane. We were talking. He got his start at the Greensboro News and Record, which is in Greensboro, North Carolina. So just like some of the best people I've worked with have gotten their starts in at local papers, and I think that's just such a good way to go. The freelance route is dicey, and there's a high probability you'll get frustrated, throw your hands up. So yeah, I mean the actual kind of staff writer job is staff writer life is a little years into it, but yeah.
What job are you freelancing?
Yeah, I mean, so far, I mean, but the job market in journalism is so volatile, as I was saying. It's like people that I'll really look up to, they're like, wow, this person really has it made. They'll get laid off and then be out of work like forever and be struggling. So like nobody's on top. Like nobody is set for very long. And those who are kind of the exception. So it's yeah, I mean, it's an industry that treats its workers very poorly. Yeah.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about some of these alternative organizations that you're working for that, you know, have been set up to
continue to ensure that investigative reporting is continuing, because, you know, we really need it, obviously. I mean, people used to say, oh, well, the bloggers will sort of take over, but, you know, they don't have a legal team to
Right.
defend them. They have, you know, no institutional support behind them, so they
Yeah.
can't really get to that kinds of stories that are so crucial, you know.
Yeah.
So these things have come along, I think, pick up a little of that need.
Yeah, no, and that's a good question. I think I feel like, well, I mean, there are a few things going on. There's like the rise of digital journalism, which is fine. Like, it's kind of good to have more jobs and more people writing, but there's becoming a bigger, I mean, they don't do the legacy papers, like the Times and the Post and the AP, in news service, provide a level of reporting that none of these digital startups that are coming to fill in the gap provide. I mean, like, there is no replacement for having beat reporters who are on a specific subject area in American life or politics when that subject area is popular and when it's not popular. And that's the reason that they're getting all the good, you know, scoops these days, all the good news stories about Trump and everything else, over and over again. It's the Washington Post and the New York Times, because they've been on these beats when BuzzFeed and Vox and these online publications have been chasing clicks with what's good with you. So, you know, and I work for a lot of digital startups, and I like them a lot, but I have a lot of admiration for these kind of legacy newspapers. New York Times and Washington Post are doing great work, and I feel like they are I mean, I think both kind of ends of the political spectrum in the United States are incredibly hostile to them. Like, obviously, the American right is not happy with the media right now, and I think there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction against big papers like the New York Times on the left. Like, I think the left doesn't like that these legacy papers do, like, both sides objective reporting. They're like, oh, it's Trump, so there aren't two sides of the story. Well, if you're not trying, if you're a reporter, sure, maybe you don't like Trump, maybe you like him, but if you're not trying to comprehend the reality of the other side, you're not going to write good stories. So, yeah, then there are these other organizations that have come to fill in the gap a little bit. ICIJ is kind of one of them, the one I work for, although it's been distracted for the past few years with the Panama Papers and Out of Paradise Papers. We've kind of become the custodians of these very, very large news data sets, which, for better or for worse, has kind of defined our mission over the past few years. I think definitely been better. And so something that's filling the gap is, like ICIJ, a lot of these are nonprofits, and they'll be there if funders will come forward. They'll be there whether, you know, after it drops off and whether the digital media bursts. And another one of these organizations, I mean, there's ProPublica, of course. It's kind of like the poster child right now for nonprofit investigative work. They do really great reporting, and they importantly, they don't really focus on what's popular. They focus on what they think is important in the public interest. And then there's the Nation Institute, which is what this Cook County story that, you know, the Nation Institute basically will, if you come to them with a story, they'll fund it. They'll say, here, like, that sounds good. Obviously, a lot of the people who are commissioning stories these days aren't paying freelancers enough to actually do a good story and do a good investigation. It's going to take a few months or even a year. So they'll come in and they'll give you a grant. There's obviously a lot of red tape, and those can be a little bit difficult to get. But yeah, I mean that's kind of the and they supply you with a fact, good fact checkers and everything else. And yeah, I mean one thing that kind of surprises people about reporting is how, I mean, like 50, it's sometimes it feels like the majority of my time as a reporter is spent fact checking. People, like, reporters are insane about getting it wrong. You can't help it. You can't get it wrong. You just can't. And when somebody does get it wrong, it's a big deal, and the publication gets a bad rap. But yeah, I think like the notion that the media is dishonest from the inside action. The media has a lot of problems, like obviously. But the notion that the media is dishonest is like, if anything, the media likes they like store good stories too much. It's like there's too much of a focus on conflict and action, which leads to which leads to like crimes and car accidents, whatever, getting like way too much play on the front pages. Am I going over now?
The next class comes on.
Another.
1.5 hours.
Oh, in a half hour.
Oh,
Okay.
no, at 2:30.
At the half hour.
Oh, at the half hour. Okay. So sorry, I'm kind of rambling at this point. Does anybody have any other questions?
Well, thank you so much for your work, and we wish
Yeah,
you
thanks.
all